Okay, so back in the garage, this is the cylinder head off the Exige. So 2zz-ge cylinder head, VVTLi, which is variable valve timing and lift intelligence. Let's just talk through quickly what those letters mean, what the components are of the cylinder head that makes it up, and then I'm going to go to putting this together so that I can check the valve clearances, make sure I don't need to order any new shims before I start the engine build, and can just progress smoothly, hopefully in a couple of weeks' time. So if we start with variable valve timing, we only have variable valve timing on the intake valves. This is the intake camshaft, and this is the unit that's responsible for the VVT. So this unit allows the gear that's driven by the timing chain to move relatively independently of the camshaft itself. It's completely controlled, it's controlled via oil pressure, and that allows you to advance or retard the timing of your camshaft versus the timing chain. So I'll just show you where those oil passages run in the cylinder head. So you'll see here there's a small passage coming out of this end surface here. That lines up with this groove in the camshaft, which has a hole on either side, which is what takes the oil that's coming out of that passage into the camshaft and out into the variable valve timing unit. And that is what controls the rotation of that unit versus the camshaft. That passage is fed by a solenoid control in this hole here, and that controls the pressure of oil that goes in and therefore the rotation of that timing gear. Okay, so that covers the VVT side of things. Now the LI, so the lift intelligence. These are the rocker arms for the 2zz-ge. You'll notice there's two surfaces that are actually pushed down by the camshafts. Firstly, this roller bearing, which is pushed down by the smaller profile cam, which is the low speed, low lift cam. And then this slipper surface here, which actually is mounted on a spring. Notice I can spring that down. That is the one driven by the high lift cam profile. Now the clever part comes in when we reach a certain RPM, which is when we want our lift to kick in. We force oil pressure through this hole in the rocker arm that goes down into this cavity and actually engages a locking pin to stop that slipper surface being able to be pushed down. If that slipper surface can't be pushed down, then it stays at this height, which you can see is much higher than the roller bearing. And then that positively engages this high lift cam profile. And that is where we get our high lift from. So that's the relative simplicity, but actually quite complicated lift system we have. The oil pressure that goes into this cavity to engage those locks comes through the rocker shafts themselves. So you'll see in the rocker shafts we've got all the different holes to actually provide the oil pressure, and that in turn is controlled by our oil control unit, which sits on this end of the cylinder head and controls how much oil pressure is going down our rocker arms, both for lubrication and to engage lift. Okay, so I've put the camshafts aside for a second, so we can now install our rockers. So when I took the head apart, I did commandeer a tray to store all of my rockers in the same position they came out of and all of the valve shims in the same position they came out of. So in theory, I should just be able to put the shims in, put the rockers in, put the camshafts back on, measure the clearances, and everything should be fine, but theory and practice are never quite the same thing. So first thing I'm going to do is take my rocker shafts, put a thin coating of my Miller's oil on there so that everything's lubricated as I put it together, and then I'm going to line up the rockers in each location and slide the rocker arm through. There are different rocker shafts for the intake and the exhaust. It's easy to work out which one's which if you look at the position of the lift bolts. So you've got a bolt hole here and a bolt hole for your lift bolt. That lines up. Whereas if I took the incorrect rocker shaft, you would see that spacing is not correct. So I can easily see this is the exhaust one, which I'll just lie there for now, and the intake one over here. So now I'm just going to put those rockers in place, lubricate everything on this side, and show you how it goes on. Slight change of plan. I'm actually going to insert the valve shims first. So this is the shims, each one slides on top of the valves, and that is what we can change to change our valve clearances. So again, I have these nicely set out in my little bolt organising box to make sure I kept them the right shims for the right valves together. So that's what should mean that I don't have to do anything with the valve clearances. But I'm going to put those in first, then put the rocker arms in, slide the shafts through, and then I'll show you how that's done. Okay, so that's one set of rockers installed. See here, that's them in place. Pretty straightforward. Next up, install the rockers on the other side. So that's the intake ones done. Do the exhaust ones. Then I'm going to put the 2 camshafts in, and I'll show you what that looks like, and then we'll do the valve clearances. So before I do put the camshafts in, I've just reinstalled the lift bolts. So you probably heard about lift bolts failing. These are the 2 lift bolts. They're pretty much new. They were new when I first built the engine, so they've done about 500 miles. 7.5 Newton meters torque on these, so not a lot, and that's why a lot of people break them. Double check those. Perfect. So really not a lot of torque at all. They're very soft bolts. They do break easily, and they hold those rocker shafts from any rotation. They hold them in place. And there we go. So camshafts are now in place. Before I put them in, I drizzled oil all the way in the surfaces they sit in, and I've drizzled oil across the top of the camshafts as well, just to make sure they're lubricated inside the bearing caps. When you install them, the first set of lobes should be pointing essentially into each other like this, and that is how they guide you to do it in the 2zz manual. Now it's a job of putting on the bearing caps. I will just make sure these are all perfectly clean before I put them on, and then bolting those down. If you look on here, it's quite clear where they go. So intake 1 facing the front of the engine, exhaust 1 facing the front of the engine goes on there like so. Pretty straightforward. Exhaust 2 facing the front of the engine, exhaust 3 facing the front of the engine. Does make it easy, there's no guesswork. And we'll push those into place. Set of bolts behind the engine here. There are 2 different types of bolt. So there's the longer ones, the shorter ones. The longer ones go in the front bearing cap, shorter ones go in every other bearing cap. So there's only 4 of these longer ones. And they just slot in there. And then you can see they've actually got different markings on the head to make it clear that they should be there. I'll do all the rest. I will then tighten it down, but finger tight, and then we'll go into the different torque settings in the tightening order. There is a specific tightening order that we have to do across here, and torque settings where we should gradually get to those settings. So I'll just install the caps and finger tighten. Okay, so that's all the bearing caps in place, all of the bolts finger tight, so holding those in place. Now I'm going to tighten them down. We're aiming for 18.5 Newton meters. I'm going to do it gradually, so I'm going to start with 11 Newton meters. We start with here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and then finishing up at the front here, 17, 18, 19, 20. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that, 11 first. Okay, so that's all of them done to 11. Now let's go to 18.5. Okay, so that's the camshafts in place and tightened down properly. So now I have to measure the valve clearances. So that involves a feeler gauge going through here. Let me get my feeler gauges and talk you through. So the camshafts are in, everything's lubricated. Now to measure the valve clearances. So when we're doing the valve clearances, we care about the distance between the small lobe and the roller bearing. And we only care about it when the small lobe is facing away from the roller bearing. So at this point, on the intake side, we can only actually check this one clearance, and we do that with a set of feeler gauges. And we slide the feeler gauge in and make sure that the clearance is in spec. So for the intake side, it should be between 0.1 and 0.16. This, a 0.15 feeler gauge just fits through, so that one is in spec. We then need to turn the camshaft so that we can check the other clearances. So we turn it one at a time. Okay, so now we can check cylinder 1. So this is facing away from the rocker arm. So first, I'm going to make sure it's over the minimum clearance, in between the small lobe and the roller bearing, and it's not. So this one's out of spec. So I need to figure out how out of spec it is. So let's try a 0.08. And a 0.08 won't go in there either. So that's quite out of spec. Need to take a look at that. But I'll rotate it and do the others. But yeah, I'm going to work my way along and do that. And the same on the exhaust side. On the exhaust side, it should be between 0.24 and 0.3 of a millimetre. So I'm just going to record all those readings and see what the spec is. So I've checked the clearance, small lobes of all of the exhaust cams and all of the intake cams. Everything is in spec aside from cylinder 1 intake cam. So unfortunately it means taking the camshafts out again, having a look at these shims, measuring those shims and seeing what shims I need to replace them with. Okay, so I've just had the camshafts out again, changed the buckets on top of these, or the shims on top of these valves, put the camshafts back in, torqued them all back down, and now that is within spec. So that is the valve clearance is done, camshafts in, that head is pretty much ready to go. Need to fit the oil control valve that controls the lift on this end with the gasket, and that's about it. So that's it all together. Valve clearance is checked, everything's torqued up. I've put the oil control system back on the back of the cylinder here. The camshaft position sensor is loosely bolted in. I don't have the right O-ring for that, so I'm going to get an O-ring to sort that out. And hopefully the next video will be me putting this on the block and starting to get the engine back together.